in a situation where you feel like you're not the right person for the job? Good, I'm seeing some nodding, so I know I'm not the only one. I think this happens in a lot of different ways. I remember when I had first graduated the insurance program I went into a training program after college, and I was in this training program for a year. They sent me from Chicago to Dallas, and within my first year graduating this program, they sent me to this client. They assigned me to them, and I went down, and there was this company that makes utility poles. Like the big, huge pole, power lines, those types of things that run through our neighborhood. Driving up and down Mountain View Corridor, you see like those kinds of utility poles, huge. And you'd pull up, you'd walk through, the office was the first building, and when you went out the back door of the office, there's this big yard, and you'd go into just this massive building where they're making utility poles, where they would bend the metal, and like those things are big if you've ever been up close to them. And I remember just looking at the scale of it and thinking, I am not the right person for this job. And then I think it was probably the second or third time I visited with this client. My contact there, I think his name was Travis, he said, do you want to go see the galvanizing plant? And I didn't honestly even know that it existed at the time. And it happened to be the second largest hot dip galvanizing tank in the world. I think now it's third because this company has built a bigger one, but it was the biggest, at the time, the biggest in North America. And so he opens the door to this building, and as soon as he opens it, I just get hit with this chemical smell. And he goes, this is the process where we wash the utility poles. And there's these chemicals in these big tanks here. The process is called pickling. And I'm like, see, I don't even like pickles. I'm not the guy for this. Yeah. And he goes, okay, let me take you back to the galvanizing room. And I remember seeing just literally this huge pool of molten zinc. Because it's hot, they got to dip the utility poles in it. And if you've ever, if you think about thunder, what happens when hot and cold air hit each other? They make noise in the sky, right? That's about all I know about meteorology. It's the same concept when you dip a cold steel pole into molten metal. The hot meets the cold, and it creates these little mini explosions. And so it starts popping and everything. He lets me watch. And there's this big plexiglass wall, so we're somewhat safe. But I'm like, okay, the crane starts lowering the pole, and I have this thought, I am not the guy to be here. I'm supposed to be risk management, occupational safety, keeping people safe. I'm I don't know the first thing about this. If somebody falls in this tank, we would never find them because it's so big. Plus, they're probably going to be melted anyway, and I'm not supposed to be here. And then they start dipping it, these little explosions start happening, and there's literally molten zinc hitting the plexiglass in front of me. And I'm like, I am not the right person for this job. Sometimes we experience this in other areas of life. If you know a bit about me, I'm pretty introverted, pretty reserved. Our 5-year-old Joel is probably the most extroverted person I've ever met. And sometimes I'm like, God, I am not the right person for this job, to be raising this precious child. It hits us in all kinds of ways, and we have this thought, I'm not the person for this job. And when we have that thought, we dwell on ourselves, and we look at things in ourselves, and we think, I'm not the right person, or we think, this job is too big for me. I can't do this. Or I just can't. There's something maybe in my past that has disqualified me. And we look at those things and we think, yeah, God, didn't you see this? Don't you remember that? I can't do this now. I can't help this person with this because that's where I was. I can't do that. Sometimes there's this mistake we focus on where we think we're disqualified. And these are become all that we can see when there's something in front of us that needs to be done. And I think God looks at these things and he shrugs them off. And I think we try to remind him and we say, but wait, God, look at this thing over here. Look what I have done. I can't do this thing that you are leading me into, that you're calling me to do. We remind him of these things and God goes, and? So? He goes, I've got this. Yeah, you can't do it on your own, but I've got this. All of these things in our past are a part of our story. But God says, you know what, your past doesn't get to define you. Only I get to do that. God says, I have things in your future. Your future is not finished yet. I'm leading you into things that you can't imagine the goodness and the joy that's going to come out of it. I don't want you to miss this, is what God says. And it's a strange thought that God would do that. And so this is the thought that we're going to focus on as we continue our series, The Strangest Sight, about how a perfect God fights for imperfect people. Remember, there's this guy, Moses, who sees a strange sight in the wilderness. There's a bush that's on fire, but it's not getting consumed. And so he all of a sudden finds himself in a conversation with God. And what we'll see today is this strange phenomenon that happens. A perfect God makes perfect plans, and then he gives imperfect people a part to play. It's really strange when you think about it. But the thing is, when we're looking at our past, and we think God looks at our past the same way, we think he's looking at what we've done and saying, I can't believe you did that. But what we're going to find out today is that God has something much more important in mind than what we do. So we'll be in Exodus chapter 3, verses 9 to 12. And so if you've missed any of this series, if you haven't been around, it's okay. You'll be able to jump right in. We've gone through Exodus 3, 1 through 8. And here's the summary so far. Moses sees this burning bush. He goes, I got to check this out. And so God meets Moses right there. He comes down to Moses, and he tells Moses, hey, I see what's happening in Egypt, that my people, the Israelites, are enslaved there, and I'm concerned. So God is sharing his concern with Moses, and then he says, I have a plan. And we talked a bit about that plan last week, and it starts in verse 9. So I want to read Exodus chapter 3, verses 9 to 12 again, just so we get the big picture of what God is doing, what's happening, and then we'll go piece by piece on the screen so you can follow along. But for now, we can just listen. The first verse, God is just going to kind of summarize his plan and what he's up to. So here's Exodus 3, 9 through 12. God is speaking. He says, and now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. So we're going to hit a lot today. We're just going to jump right back into verse 9. So here's what's happening. God's speaking. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. This is really kind of a summary and a restatement of what God has already told Moses so far. It's very similar to verse 7. I'm going to read verse 7 from last week and just kind of read along verse 9 and see the parallels as I read this. Here's verse 7 with verse 9 on the screen. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. A lot of the very same words God is using just 2 verses apart in this conversation. And in between, what we have is verse 8, where God actually gives Moses the plan. He says, I'm going to rescue them. I'm going to come in and I'm going to rescue my people. But there's a really important difference between verse 7 and verse 9. In verse 7, remember, God says, what does he see? He says, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. But what does he see here in verse 9? He says, I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. I don't want to miss this morning. This isn't the main thing we're going to focus on, but I don't want to miss this, that God sees both sides of the story. That he's not going to be tricked. He's not going to be fooled about who's right and who's wrong. He's not going to be tricked about who is the abuser and who is being abused. God sees these things and he knows, and he will act accordingly. And then verse 10 comes. He says, so now go. Moses, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And I think Moses, right now at this point, is having a little bit of a moment, probably a bit of a crisis, where he's like, hold on, God, wait a second. You drew me over here. I thought you were just having story time. I thought you were just telling me what you're up to and what you're going to do, and now you're saying I have to go and do it. I didn't sign up for this. I did not volunteer. I didn't sign on the dotted line. I think we have this attitude. Sometimes we're like, hold on, wait, God, I know you want to do something there, but I did not sign up to be a part of it. But this is just what God does. A perfect God fights for imperfect people by making us part of his plan. God could go into Egypt himself, send his presence there in a powerful way, and he could accomplish what he wants to accomplish. And yet he says, Moses, you have a part to play. You're going to be involved in this. Remember a couple of verses ago, God even said, I am going to rescue them. I'm going to bring them out of Egypt. But Moses gets to play a part. We get to be partners with God. It reminds me of when I was a kid growing up, I played lacrosse. And I can think of there are lots of games that went into overtime, but I can think of 2 overtime games specifically. And one of them, I was in 4th grade, playing for the Lionville U11 team, under 11. We wore blue jerseys. I was number 3. We were playing Pottstown, who was the black team, and we went into overtime. I remember this conversation with my coach. I told him, hey, I don't want to play midfield. I want to play attack, which is kind of the offense position in lacrosse. And he goes, no, we need you at midfield. And I remember playing in this game, and there's a loose ball right in the middle of the field, and I pick it up, and I run down the field, and I shoot the ball, and it goes over the goalie's left shoulder. And I remember running around the back of the goal with my arms in the air. We just won the game. Sudden death in overtime in lacrosse. Always sudden death. And I remember so vividly, even that silly conversation with my coach, where I said, hey, I want to do this, and he goes, no, I want you here. I also remember an overtime game a few years later, and this time I was not playing during overtime. And we won, and I remember running on the field. I remember kind of the celebration. I couldn't tell you who scored the goal. I couldn't tell you how it happened. I just don't remember. There's something different when we get to be on the field than when we're on the sideline. There's something different when we get to be in the middle of what God is doing and be involved. It's much more vivid. It's much more real. We get what's happening because we're in the middle of it. But if we're just watching from the sideline, we miss out. So if we go, like Moses went, if we are like Moses and go, we get to be a part of what God is doing. We get to celebrate with God when he does something. But if we don't go, we miss out. I think sometimes we get caught up looking at other people. And we say, man, how are they doing that? How do they have it all together? How are they achieving that success? And we forget that it's really not them, but it's God in their life. It's God working in and through them. When we go, we remember, this is not me. I couldn't do this on my own. We remember that it's God at work. When we go, when we are obedient to God in the going where he leads us, we get to experience something. God is saying, I want to share this joy with you. I want to share this moment with you. I want you to grow through it. I want you to be transformed in the process. Yeah, I could just go and do this myself. I could make it all happen. But I want you to be in it because I want a relationship with you. I want to be with you in the process. There's something different that happens when a perfect God involves imperfect people. Yeah, it gets messier. The plan doesn't always go exactly the way God intended because we get in the way. But he wants that relationship with us. He wants to share that with us. And so Moses responds in, I think, a pretty natural way. He says, who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He's saying, I'm not the right guy for this job. And if we remember Moses' past, if we remember his story and what brought him to here, we're like, yeah, God, he's got a point. He's the guy who killed a dude in Egypt and then ran away because Pharaoh wanted to kill him for it. And now he's been spending all this time in the wilderness with somebody else's sheep. And I think if the sheep could talk, they'd probably agree. They'd be like, God, he's not that special. He's just been wandering around with us for 40 years. Like, we've gotten to know him pretty well. He kind of smells like us and he's dumb like us too. Like, it doesn't make sense. Moses says, who am I? It's a valid question. It's a valid question. So who is Moses? And I think it's really simple, but I think it's also incredibly complex and profound. This is who Moses is. Moses is the one God chose for the job. It's that simple and it's that profound. Moses hadn't done anything to earn this position. Moses hasn't really done a whole lot to show, in our eyes, in our mind, what he could add to, what he could bring to this assignment that God has given him when he goes down to Egypt. The thing is, we might not get it. We may not understand, why does God choose the people he does? Why does he use the people he does? But the simple and the complex and the profound truth of it is, God chooses who he chooses, and he works through them, and he uses them. And I think there are a couple of things we can see in addition to that too in the situation here. If we really look carefully, if we try to see what's happening with God's eyes, not as if we could, but if we just try, there's a couple of things we can see and know that are happening here. The first is that God is sending Moses. Moses is a guy who's been with sheep, remember they're his father-in-law's sheep, not even his own, for 40 years. I love my father-in-law. I can't imagine working in his business with his stuff for 40 years. And never have anything of my own. And if we pay attention to what God is doing, if we try to turn around and look from God's perspective, I think we can almost hear God saying, Moses, you know what? If you care this much about sheep that don't belong to you, for 40 years you will lead them through the wilderness to water. You'll lead them to pasture where they can eat and be nourished. You'll protect them from predators. You'll sleep in the grass and in the dirt with them. If you will care this much for this long about sheep who are not yours, how much more are you going to care for your own people when I send you to them? So Moses has been a part of God's plan for a while, it seems like. Moses has been a part of God's plan all along, and we didn't know it while we were reading it. Moses certainly didn't know it, but all along, God has been preparing Moses because he's been part of the plan the whole time. So your past doesn't define you. Moses' murder in Egypt, running away from the consequences, wandering the wilderness with sheep, does not define him. God does. God says, I'm the one who gets to define you. It's not about where you've been. It's not about your past. The thing is, when we are caught up in where we've been, God cares about something much more important. When we're caught up in where we've been, God cares much more about where we're going, where he's leading us. When we are stuck in our minds on who we've been, God cares much more about who we're becoming, who he has created, and who he is leading each and every one of us uniquely to be. God cares about our future. He says, your future is not finished yet. I get to decide who you are. I get to define you. I get to give you your identity. And here's the other thing that we cannot miss that God is doing. Here's another reason I think God chose Moses. God is a redeemer. God is a redeemer. He is redeeming things. He loves to redeem people and places and things and situations. He loves to redeem. It's really easy for us as Christians to think about God in the future as this kind of far-off redeemer. We think about salvation and we think about the day when Jesus comes back and restores all things. And he's a redeemer. He'll redeem everything that has been made wrong or been messed up. And that's true. But we also forget about the fact that God is a redeemer now today. God is redeeming. He is in the process. He is in the act of redeeming. And that's what he's doing with Moses, I think. People who read the Bible and study the Bible scholars who are much smarter than I am, talk about this concept called the grand narrative of the Bible. And we need to understand this to understand what it means that God is a redeemer today, that he's redeeming right now. And here it is. We talk about the creation. Genesis 1:1, the very first verse of the Bible, the first sentence of the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1 and 2, again, the first book of the Bible is Genesis. The first two chapters are about creation, what God is doing, how he's doing it, what's going on. And then Genesis chapter 3 is called the fall because it's when the first humans decide, you know what, God? We got this on our own. We're going to go our own way. They rebelled against God. And because of that, everything became fallen. People now inherit the sinful nature when we're born. If we think about natural disasters, it's because it wasn't just humanity that fell. All of creation fell at this time. So earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, this is a result of the fall. And then there's redemption. this process of making all things right again. And it will be completed at the final restoration when Jesus comes back, restores all things, makes everything right again, the new creation, new heavens, new earth. We get to look forward in this moment to the restoration, but it doesn't change that right now, in this moment, this is the chapter we're living in. Redemption. And we're not just passively put here in redemption. We get to be active participants in it. God made a place for an imperfect Moses to be part of his plan, to be part of what he was doing. We get to be involved in God's work of redemption. What is redemption? Very simply, if we define each one of these 4 stages, if you will, creation is how things were, how they were intended to be. The fall is how things are. Redemption is how things could be. And the restoration is how things ultimately will be when Jesus comes back. So we're living in this phase of how things could be. What redemption is taking things from the way they are, from the fall, toward the way that they will be when Jesus comes back. That's redemption. It's that simple. And this is actually, I think, a really good test for us to think about, okay, is this something that God is really doing? Is this something God is up to? Or is this something that, I just want to do? Is this something that somebody else is doing? Maybe the enemy is doing this. The devil is trying to orchestrate something. This is a really good test for us. Is what we think God might be up to, is it bringing joy and hope and grace and provision and mercy? Is it bringing healing and unity and hope? In other words, real simply, is it leading to life? Is it leading toward the way things ultimately will be? Or is it bringing division and discord and disunity and fear and pain and judgment? Is it coming out of pride, and is it hurting people? In other words, is it pointing to death? Is it pointing forward toward the restoration, or is it pointing people back to get stuck in this fallen state of how things are? That's a test for us to determine, is this something that God is really up to, or is it coming from somewhere else? So Moses just asked God, who am I that you're sending me back to Pharaoh? What am I going to do about this? I'm not the right guy for the job. And God responds with such grace that he doesn't even answer the question. I don't think you and I would want him to answer that question, honestly, sometimes. Well, Moses, you killed a guy. And anyway, this is how God responds in verse 12. And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain, the very place that you're standing now. There's 2 promises in this verse. And what that tells us is God's prompting is always backed by his promises. Always backed by his promises. If God is leading you to do something, there is a promise there that he wants to bring you into. It might not always be clear from the start, but we'll get to that in a minute. God's got a promise. So here are the 2 promises. The first is pretty clear. I will be with you. That's what God says. So it's not about Moses' ability. It's not about what Moses can do. What is much more important in this situation is God's power. God's working. God is involved in the situation. It's easy for us to read the Bible and look for ourselves in it. We try to do that all the time. We look for ourselves in every single story. Here's the thing. The Bible is not primarily about us. The Bible, I know that might hurt a little bit. We're self-centered. The Bible is not primarily about us. It is about God's involvement with people. It's about God's story and how he is involved in redeeming people, redeeming fallen humanity. It's about his plan to save the world through himself. And I think here's another little test for us. Is this something that God is really up to? We go to his word. The Bible is his story about how he is redeeming people, how he is involved presently in human events. Then we think about the situation. We say, is this what God is doing? Does it align with God's word? What he has revealed about himself to be true? What he has revealed about humanity and the world to be true? With what he is doing in this overall, remember the grand narrative, in this phase of redemption leading to the restoration? Does this align with what I'm thinking and feeling? If not, it's probably not God's work. It's probably originating from somewhere else. So that's the first promise, I will be with you. The second promise comes in the second part of the verse. He says, this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. That's the promise at the end there. You will worship God on this mountain. So, in this section of the verse, there's a lot of God talking to Moses. He says you like 4 times, and he's talking to Moses. This will be the sign to you, Moses, that it is I who have sent you. When you, Moses, have brought the people out of Egypt, you all, plural, will worship God on this mountain. That's the promise. Remember, he said, not if. I'll bring the verse up. Not if you have brought the people. When you have brought the people, I'm going to be in it. I'm the assurance. You can take this to the bank because God says I'm going to do it. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you all, plural, Israel, will worship God on this mountain. That's the promise. And this can't happen unless God does what he says he will do, which is bring the people out of Egypt and rescue them. It can't happen unless God does what he says he will do. But notice that the fulfillment of the promise will be the result of faith. Moses has to take a step. We don't, in Exodus 4, we don't get a whole lot of the story of Moses on his way to Egypt. Moses goes to his father-in-law and says, hey, I got to go back to Egypt. His father-in-law sends him. I can imagine that every step of the way back to Egypt, Moses has to trust God. Every single step. Otherwise, what would he do? He would just turn around. Well, I haven't gotten to Pharaoh yet, so nobody will know that I just didn't do the thing God told me to do. He had to trust in every step. The promise will be the result. The fulfillment of the promise will be the result of Moses' faith. But here's the other thing. It's also already happening. God says, I will be with you. Well, here he is with Moses. God says, you're going to come back and worship God on this mountain. Moses is already standing before God on this very mountain. If God can do it once, come to Moses. Remember, Moses is wandering the wilderness. It wasn't like he was sitting in his house every night. He was wandering the wilderness, and God knew exactly where he was and drew him in. God went to Moses. If God can bring Moses to this mountain in that situation, surely God can do it again and bring Moses back to this mountain with all of the Israelites just like he's promised. God's prompting is always backed by his promises, and God's promises are greater than our potential. Remember, Moses has maybe shown a bit of potential. God's been preparing him by leading the sheep. But leading sheep through the wilderness is very different than leading a nation of slaves out of slavery from a king who wants to keep them there. That's not something Moses can do on his own. God's promises are greater than our potential. And we have these Moses moments, don't we? I'm not talking about the glorious moments. I'm not talking about the, go and, oh, there's a bush over there, I better go check it out. I'm talking about, God, who am I? We have these moments just like Moses. Who am I that you've put this thing before me, that you've led me into this thing? But God sees from a different perspective. We base our potential on our past, where we've been, who we've been. We look at that just to determine where we could maybe go in the future. We base our potential on our past, but God bases our potential on his promises. And his promises are greater than our potential. He says, I know you couldn't do this on your own, but I'm going to be with you. It's my power that matters in this situation because I want to share this with you. When we're stuck in our past, God sees our future. And why do we get stuck in the past? I'm going to tell you what I think. I think we get stuck in our past because we want to do the impossible. It's this paradox where God is calling Moses forward into a future of something that seems impossible. But it's not impossible because God's there. God can do it. We get stuck in our past because we want to do the impossible. We want to try to make up for it. But it's impossible. We can't do it. We can't make up for our past. If we've messed up once, then we've messed up. And we can't go back to fixing it. We can't fix it on our own. We can't fix the past. We can't do it. We can't make ourselves right with God. We can't prove ourselves to be worthy of God and worthy of his presence. Only Jesus can do that. And Jesus has done the impossible by making imperfect people perfect and holy in the eyes of God through his death on our behalf that we deserved. Jesus has done the impossible. The thing is, Moses became the mediator between God and Israel. Moses would have this conversation with God, and then he'd go to Israel and he'd kind of bring word from God. And he'd talk to them, and then he'd go back to God with word from Israel. And he was the mediator. He was the one that would go between. He was the mediator because God called him. Jesus is the mediator between all people and God the Father because God sent him. He is God in the flesh, come to be with us, to be in the mess, entering the mess with imperfect people, so that every one of us could approach God personally. Remember, Jesus is God. Jesus is God in the flesh. And so if God is our mediator, then we get to go have direct access to God. There's no intermediary. There's no mediator in between us anymore. We have direct access to God, and he invites us to himself, and he invites us to be part of his plan and part of the work that he's doing to redeem the world. Jesus is a fulfillment of every one of God's promises. And God's promises are greater than our potential. Perfect God makes imperfect people a part of his plan. And he's already made up for your past. All we have to do is say yes. All we have to do is put our trust and our faith and our hope in Jesus for eternal life. And I think that we can trust God to do that. I think that we can trust God to fulfill every one of his promises because he's proven that he'll hold nothing back to fulfill his promises. He sent his very son. And so we know that he is with us when we take that first step. Remember that first step Moses had to take back toward Egypt. We know he's with us. We can trust him with that first step. Whether that first step is toward him because we don't know him yet, we haven't made him Lord of our lives yet, or maybe that first step, that next step that we need to trust him with is actually alongside of him but out toward the world. To be active participants in this work of redemption. Not just passively waiting for God to do his thing. So we can trust him with those things. His prompting is always backed by his promises. And if we're paying really close attention, I think we think oftentimes that life is kind of menial, right? Sometimes we can't find the meaning in it. But if we pay really close attention to what God is doing, remember that he is a redeemer, actively, currently, presently redeeming things. Then I think we'll see that all along he has been preparing us for that next step.